Karen called the cops on a black man walking his dog. He once saved her granddaughter's life. Chapter 1. The Leash and the Look. It was a calm spring morning in Millstone Ridge, the kind of suburban neighborhood where every lawn looked like it had been trimmed with nail clippers, and dogs were expected to poop only in pre-approved corners of the world. Retired Officer James Holloway, 62, walked with a steady rhythm down Willow Bend Drive. His left hand held a worn leather leash attached to a large golden retriever named Duke. The dog walked obediently by his side, tail wagging with a kind of quiet dignity. James wore his usual khakis, a dark polo shirt, and an old NYPD baseball cap, slightly faded from years in the sun. His skin was the shade of dark roasted coffee, and his eyes carried that calm but alert look that only comes from decades on the force. If you looked closer, you'd see the faint scar running behind his left ear, a memory from a bullet that had missed his skull by inches. But on this day, Karen Witherspoon didn't look close. She didn't see the badge etched onto his heart or the heroism stitched into his past. She saw a black man, with a big dog, walking too slow, on a street with expensive houses. That was enough for her to pull out her phone. Chapter 2. The Call. Karen stood behind her hedge, iPhone in hand, whispering into the receiver like she was reporting a hostage situation. She had shoulder-length platinum blonde hair and wore a pastel pink robe, despite it being nearly noon. Her lips were tight, her voice shrill. "Yes, hi. I'd like to report a suspicious person. He's walking a large dog up and down the street. I don't think he lives here." "Ma'am," came the dispatcher's voice, "is the person doing anything illegal?" "Well, he's lingering, just walking real slow and looking at houses." "Is he approaching any houses?" "No, but he's just, he doesn't belong here. This is a quiet community." "What is he wearing?" "Khakis and a dark shirt, baseball cap. It says NYPD, but, well, anybody can buy those online, right?" The dispatcher paused. "Ma'am, what's his race?" Karen didn't hesitate. "Black." Chapter 3. The Officers. Two patrol cars rolled up to Willow Bend Drive 10 minutes later, lights flashing, but sirens off. They were trying not to escalate, yet. James had stopped by the neighborhood community board to read a flyer about an upcoming bake sale. Duke sat calmly by his side, tail thumping the sidewalk. When the officers approached, he turned slowly. "Can I help you, fellas?" he asked. The younger officer, a redhead named Officer Burns, looked nervous. His partner, Officer Delgado, looked annoyed. "We got a call about a suspicious person," Burns said. James blinked. "Doing what?" "Walking a dog, loitering." James raised an eyebrow. "Loitering while walking?" There's a report. A resident said you didn't look familiar." James chuckled and reached slowly into his back pocket, pulling out his wallet. "You know I used to be you," he said, flipping it open. Inside was a laminated NYPD ID with his photo from 10 years ago. Below it was a worn badge, still gleaming in the morning light. Delgado leaned in and muttered, "Holy shit." "Retired detective first grade," James said calmly. 32 years on the job. Served in Brooklyn and later in Staten Island. 2 medals of valor. I live 4 blocks that way." Officer Burns cleared his throat. "Sir, James raised a hand. "Save it. I know the routine." Duke wagged his tail and barked once, like he was backing his human up. Karen stood across the street, watching from her porch, arms crossed, phone still in hand. When James looked at her, she flinched and went back inside. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Neighborhood. By sunset, the story had already spread across the neighborhood group chat. "Karen called the cops on a retired cop? Did you see that poor man just trying to walk his dog? I heard he saved someone's life once. Leave it to Karen to mistake a hero for a threat." But the twist hadn't come out yet. Not the part that would really send shockwaves through Millstone Ridge. Because no one, not even Karen, remembered the name of the man who, 5 years ago, had jumped fully clothed into Lakeside Park to save a child who had fallen off a pier. No one remembered him except the little girl, and her name was Chloe, Karen's granddaughter. Chapter 5. The Rescue. It had been a summer day, 5 years ago. The lake shimmered under a blue sky. Chloe had just turned 6 and loved feeding ducks. Karen, distracted by a phone call, had turned her back for just a second. That was all it took. Chloe had leaned too far over the edge. The wood beneath her shoes was slick. She slipped, and her small body splashed into the lake. She didn't scream. The water swallowed her whole. James had been there, walking Duke, like always. He didn't hesitate. He handed his leash to a stranger, kicked off his shoes, and dove into the water in one smooth motion. Years of NYPD drills kicked in. He reached her in seconds. By the time Karen turned around screaming for help, Chloe was already in James's arms, coughing and clinging to him like a kitten pulled from a storm drain. "I got you, sweetheart," he'd whispered. Karen had thanked him, briefly, but she was too rattled to remember his name, too proud to stay long. She whisked Chloe away before he could even dry off. James never expected a parade. He didn't even tell anyone. But that moment, he'd never forget that little girl's eyes, and neither would Chloe. Chapter 6. Chloe remembers. Now 11, Chloe sat on the porch swing when James passed by again the next morning. She recognized the dog first, Duke. Then she looked up and saw him. She dropped her book and ran across the lawn barefoot. "Hey," she called. James turned, surprised. "Hey there, kiddo." "You're the man from the lake," she said breathlessly. Karen stepped out of the house just in time to hear that. Her face froze. James smiled at Chloe. "And you're the girl who gave me the biggest scare of my life." "I remember you saved me," she beamed. "I never got to thank you." James knelt slightly. "You just did." Karen stepped forward. "Chloe, inside, now." "But Grandma." "Now." Chloe obeyed, looking confused. Karen stared at James, her lips pursed. "I didn't recognize you," she muttered. "You didn't care to," James said. "You just saw what you wanted to see." There was a long silence. Then Karen turned and walked away. Chapter 7. The HOA Meeting. A week later, the Millstone Ridge HOA held its monthly meeting. Normally, it was just a bunch of older folks arguing about mailbox heights and hedge regulations. But this time, the air was different. Karen sat on the board, as she had for years. She always wore her pastel suit and carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. James attended for the first time. He didn't plan to speak, just watch. The president, a short man named Harold, opened with the usual agenda, until a neighbor raised their hand. "I'd like to talk about the incident on Willowbend Drive," said Marissa Kim, a single mother who lived 2 streets over. "A false police report was filed on one of our residents." Karen's face went red. "That's not on the agenda," she snapped. "It is now," said another voice. Heads turned. It was Officer Delgado, out of uniform. "I'd like to make a public statement," he said. Karen tried to object, but Harold waved her down. Delgado stepped forward. "Last week, a resident called the police to report someone who, in her words, didn't look like he belonged. That man was a retired NYPD detective, a man who served the city for over 30 years, and who, by the way, once saved the life of a child in this very community." There was a murmur in the room. Karen looked around, suddenly alone. Harold cleared his throat. "Do you have anything to say, Karen?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. James stood then, calm, measured. "I didn't come here for an apology," he said. "I came here so you all remember something. Justice isn't a privilege for the familiar. It's a right for the forgotten. And if you ever forget that again, I'll be here to remind you." The room went silent. Then Chloe stood up, hands trembling. "He saved my life," she said loud and clear. And in that moment, the whole room knew. Karen didn't just report a black man. She reported a hero. Chapter 8. The Letter. 2 days after the HOA meeting, Karen received a letter, not an email, not a memo, a real handwritten letter. That fact alone rattled her. The handwriting was steady, elegant even, on crisp cream stationery. "Dear Mrs. Witherspoon, I debated whether or not to write this, but I believe closure is more important than comfort. You don't remember my name, but I remember your face. I remember you clinging to your granddaughter on that dock while I held her, coughing up lake water, alive. I remember your panic. I remember the way your voice cracked with fear. What I don't remember is a thank you. And maybe I never needed one, until you called the police on me for walking down a street I've walked for years. I don't want an apology. What I want is for you to ask yourself, if I had been a white man with a leash, would you have called? People like me don't need you to be nice. We just need you to be fair. Sincerely, James Holloway. Karen sat motionless for minutes after reading it. No one had ever written to her like that, not even her late husband. She folded the letter, then refolded it, then finally tucked it into the back of a drawer she never opened. Out of sight didn't mean out of mind. Chapter 9. The past comes knocking. Later that week, Karen visited her daughter, Melissa, Chloe's mother. She hadn't told Melissa what happened. Not about the police call, not about James, not even about the HOA meeting. But Chloe had. As soon as Karen walked in, Melissa folded her arms. "We need to talk," she said coldly. Karen blinked. "About what?" "About how you called the cops on a man who saved my daughter's life." Karen sighed. "Melissa, I didn't know it was him. You didn't ask." The house was quiet except for the ticking of the vintage wall clock Karen had gifted Melissa on her wedding day. Melissa looked her mother straight in the eye. "I know you think you're protecting the neighborhood, but what you did was wrong. And frankly, it's not the first time." Karen's mouth tightened. "I don't see how this... You never liked Marissa's kids playing outside. You told Terrence next door his music was too urban when he was just listening to jazz. And now this?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Melissa didn't let her. "Chloe adores Mr. Holloway. She asked me if she could draw him something to say thank you. You want to talk about belonging? That man belongs more here than anyone I know." Karen left without saying a word. Chapter 10. A simple drawing. The next morning, James found an envelope wedged into his front door. Inside was a crayon drawing. It showed him standing by the lake, holding a small girl's hand. Duke was beside them, tail wagging. There were sparkles drawn around the lake like magic dust. And at the bottom, "Thank you for saving me. Love, Chloe." James stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he placed it inside a photo frame and set it next to his police medals. Not all gratitude comes when you expect it. Some arrives exactly when you need it most. Chapter 11. The petition. Meanwhile, the fallout from Karen's actions continued to ripple. Neighbors who once blindly followed her lead began questioning everything. Marissa Kim started a petition to reform the HOA's bylaws, especially concerning racial bias and suspicion-based complaints. James, though not directly involved, quietly supported it. The petition gathered over 200 signatures in 3 days. Karen was stunned. "This neighborhood used to stand for something," she grumbled at the next board meeting. "It still does," replied Harold, "but now we want it to stand for everyone." That one hit her hard. She began to feel the walls closing in. For the first time in her years on the board, she was outnumbered. Chapter 12. Karen's breaking point. Karen tried to take back control the only way she knew how: rules. She sent out passive-aggressive reminders about proper leash lengths, quiet hours, and approved lawn decorations. But nobody cared anymore. People were different now. Marissa waved at James when he walked by. A group of kids shouted, "Hey, Mr. H," every afternoon. Even Duke seemed to wag his tail with a little more pride. Karen sat on her porch one evening, watching all of this unfold, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: irrelevance. It ached more than she expected. Chapter 13. The Unexpected Visitor. One rainy afternoon, there was a knock on James's door. He opened it to find Karen holding a pie. He stared at her for a moment. She cleared her throat. "I baked this, well, store-bought, but I thought I wanted to say thank you for what you did for Chloe." James took the pie, said nothing. Karen looked down, awkward. "And I'm sorry about the call." "Which one?" he asked, not smiling. Karen closed her eyes briefly. "All of them." "Sure." James stepped aside. "You want to come in and say hi to Duke?" She hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the house was warm, walls lined with books and police memorabilia. Duke trotted up, sniffed her once, then rested his head on her thigh. Karen patted him nervously. "I didn't grow up around people like you," she said softly. James sat across from her. People like what? Karen didn't answer. James nodded slowly. I know, but now you do. Chapter 14. Learning to Unlearn. In the weeks that followed, Karen began showing up to the community events she used to scoff at. She sat in on diversity workshops the HOA hosted after the bylaw reforms passed. She even walked with Chloe to James's house one afternoon and handed him a stack of HOA newsletters. Thought you might want to write a column, she said. James laughed. What? Me? The HOA Gazette? Chloe thought it was a good idea, Karen added quickly. James glanced down at the girl who smiled wide. Guess I'm hired. Henry. Chapter 15. The column. James never imagined himself as a columnist, but there he was, typing away at an old laptop, glasses perched on his nose, Duke asleep at his feet. The headline Chloe picked out read, From the Beat to the Bench, Thoughts from a Retired Cop. His first column wasn't flashy. It was quiet, reflective. I've seen a lot of neighborhoods, some full of love, some full of fear. The difference? Whether people look at each other and see strangers or neighbors. We don't need more rules, we need more understanding. The leash isn't just for the dog, it's for our judgment too. When the newsletter went out, it sparked conversation all over Millstone Ridge. Even the grumpiest residents admitted James could write. Chapter 16. Karen's Walk. Karen began taking early morning walks, not to patrol, not to judge, just to walk. At first, people gave her looks, a few cold shoulders, some ignored her, but she kept showing up. She picked up stray litter, helped a teen fix his bicycle chain. She even waved awkwardly at Marissa. Morning, she muttered. Marissa blinked. Good morning, Karen. Small cracks in the wall. That's how healing starts. Chapter 17. The HOA votes. The next HOA election loomed. Karen had always run unopposed, but this year a young black teacher named Reggie Hill decided to run for the board. He was charismatic, smart, and had real ideas for change. Karen's first instinct? Defend her seat. But something stopped her. She invited Reggie to coffee. I think it's time someone new got a shot, she said. And honestly, you'd be damn good at this. Reggie raised an eyebrow. Wait, are you endorsing me? She smiled for real. Don't make me regret it. Reggie won the election in a landslide. Karen stood and clapped the loudest. Chapter 18. One last incident. Despite the changes, old habits died hard. One morning, an anonymous tip came in about a suspicious teenager sitting on the curb near the community park. A new neighbor called the police. The boy was Reggie's nephew, waiting for his ride to school. When the squad car pulled up, James happened to be walking Duke nearby. He stepped in immediately. Hey, that's Marcus Hill, he told the officers. Top of his class, wants to be an engineer. He's doing nothing wrong. The officers nodded and moved on. No harm done. But the moment left a mark. Karen heard about it and felt the chill down her spine. That could have been worse. Much worse. That night, she dropped off a handwritten note to Reggie's door. I can't change the past, but I promise to stand guard with you from now on. This time, on the right side. Chapter 19. Chloe's Speech. Millstone Ridge hosted a community day that summer with music, food trucks, and a stage set up on the green. Chloe, now 12 and confident, stood on the stage in front of the crowd with a microphone in her hand. My name is Chloe, and this is my story, she began. She told them about falling into the lake, about the man who saved her, about what it felt like to realize someone had judged him just for walking their street. I learned something, she said. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. They wear khakis. And sometimes we need to teach grown-ups how to be brave too. Karen sat in the front row, hand pressed to her mouth, eyes misting over. James stood off to the side, arms crossed, proud but silent. Chapter 20. Together on the porch. That evening, the sun dipped low over Millstone Ridge. James sat on his porch sipping sweet tea. Karen approached slowly, holding a second glass. Peace offering, she said. He took it. I don't hold grudges, she smiled. Good, because I hold on to guilt like it's an Olympic sport. They both laughed softly. Duke rested his head on Karen's shoe. She reached down and gently stroked behind his ears. You know, she said, I used to think people like me were the backbone of neighborhoods, keeping order, holding standards. And now, James asked. Karen looked out at the sunset. Now I think the backbone is the ones who show up, who help, who walk dogs and dive into lakes. James raised his glass. To the walkers and the swimmers. Karen clinked hers against it. To second chances. Chapter 21. A new leash on life fall arrived in Millstone Ridge with crisp leaves and warm sweaters. The trees turned golden, and front lawns were dotted with pumpkins and scarecrows. James had just come back from his annual fishing trip with a few retired buddies when he noticed something unusual. On Karen's lawn, next to her traditional fall decor, stood a brand new sign, "All are welcome here, including heroes on leashes." He couldn't help but chuckle. Later that week, he passed by her house again and found her crouched in the yard trying to hang up lights. I've seen tactical units hang barbed wire with less effort, James said, grinning. Karen wiped her brow and laughed. Well, you're welcome to assist, but only if you promise not to file a noise complaint against my ladder. Chapter 22, The Unexpected Interview. One day, a young local reporter knocked on James's door. Her name was Nina Flores, and she worked for the county's community feature magazine. I'm doing a piece on neighborhood changemakers, she said. I'd love to feature you. James blinked. Me? Nina smiled. You're the guy who walks the dog and somehow walked a whole neighborhood into being better. He agreed hesitantly. During the interview, he told stories from his days on the force, the lake rescue, and even the day Karen called the cops on him. But the real story, James added, isn't about me. Nina looked puzzled. Then who is it about? James looked out the window, where Karen was teaching a group of kids how to carve pumpkins. It's about people who get it wrong, and then try to make it right. Chapter 23, Karen's Apology. Public. This time. A month later, the magazine issue came out. On the cover, James, Duke, and Chloe standing beneath a fall tree. Inside, there was an editorial submitted by Karen herself. She had titled it, The Day I Called the Cops on My Conscience. I was raised to believe that order was everything, that strangers needed watching, that rules kept us safe. What I wasn't taught is that fear sometimes wears the mask of righteousness. I judged a man by his color, not his character. I assumed the worst of the man who once gave my family his best. I will carry that shame forever. But I am working every day to be better, because redemption isn't a moment, it's a process. Thank you, Mr. Holloway, for more than the rescue, for the lesson. The community was stunned and moved. Even her fiercest critics nodded in reluctant respect. It wasn't perfection, but it was accountability. Chapter 24, Chloe's Club. Inspired by everything that had happened, Chloe decided to start a group at her school. She called it the Second Chance Club. Its mission? Teach kids to speak up, to own their mistakes, and to give people room to grow. James was their first guest speaker. He stood in front of a class of sixth graders and told them stories of the street, the badge, the lake, and the leash. When one student asked, "Did you forgive her?" he smiled and said, "I didn't forgive her because she deserved it. I forgave her because I deserve peace." Chapter 25, A Walk Together. It became a tradition. Every Sunday morning, James and Karen would walk Duke together around the neighborhood. They walked slowly, not because of age, but because they were present. Not patrolling, not watching, just walking. Neighbors waved, children ran by on scooters. There was no fear, no suspicion, just life. One morning, Karen looked over at James. "Do you ever think, maybe this whole thing happened for a reason?" James gave her a sideways smile. "I think everything happens for a reason, but sometimes it takes the leash snapping for folks to finally stop and listen." They walked on, side by side, no longer strangers, not even just neighbors, friends. Epilogue, the bench years later, long after Duke had passed on and Karen had retired from the HOA for good, the community installed a new bench in Lakeside Park. On the back of it was a brass plaque, in honor of James Holloway, who walked with grace, who saved with courage, and who taught us all what it means to truly belong. Underneath, in smaller print, dedicated by the people of Millstone Ridge, and one very changed Karen. Chloe, now in college, came back to visit that bench every fall. She would sit there with her sketchbook and draw. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, she swore she could still hear Duke's tail thumping.